Can everyone hear me and see me? I can see you, so okay. Well, I'm here to talk about what I consider to be one of the largest, if not the largest, human rights violation in our country today, and that is solitary confinement. But before I begin to talk about the practice here, let me say a little bit more about how I came to be able to speak with authority on this issue. In 2009, I had been at college in UC Berkeley, graduated, and I was teaching and doing a lot of direct action to stop the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. When I met my now husband, Shane Bauer, he was fluent in Arabic and had been working as a journalist in the Middle East. I'd been doing international solidarity work with the Zapatistas in Chiapas and around Palestine and other issues. And so the two of us coming together right away, we decided let's move to the Middle East and continue our work there. So I was living in Damascus for more than a year. It was one of the best years of my life. I was starting out as a journalist, and over 1 million Iraqi refugees lived in Damascus at the time. It was, of course, before the horrible state that we see Syria in today. It was a vibrant, exciting year of my life where I was in a community of activists and artists and really thriving. I had 2 weeks off of my work, and we decided to go to northern Iraq. At the time, northern Iraq was a safe place for adventure travelers like myself. No American had been killed there during the wars. No American actually has ever been killed or captured there until more recently. So we spent a few weeks just tooling around, seeing amazing museums, going to old castles, learning about Kurdish culture. It's a unique part of Iraq with its own borders, its own history. Really should have been made its own country, but instead it's a semi-autonomous part. After a few weeks, we decided that we kept seeing these posters of these green, beautiful mountains. And in Syria, there's not much greenery. It's a beautiful country, but we were lured and attracted to this place called Ahmed Awa. Our hotel manager and many other people said that's the place to go. When we arrived, there were hundreds of people at this lake. It was a river with shops, and we hiked up this mountain to where the waterfall was. And for some reason, when Kurdish people camp with their families, they bring their televisions. I'm not clear on how they had them plugged in, but people were dancing, there was TV, there was music, and we felt very welcomed, and we decided to spend the night. And the next morning, we asked a tea vendor to point out a trail. And if we made any mistake, our concept of a hike was probably very different than that tea vendor's concept of a hike. Maybe he thought we'd go for 10 or 15 minutes, and we hiked for several hours. It was a gorgeous day. We kept wanting to get to the top of the ridge, and it just seemed right around the corner, just a little farther, and we'd get this, amazing view of where we were. When we got to the top of the ridge, we saw a soldier with a large gun, and he gestured for us to go farther down the path and then to him. And when we got to him, he pointed to the ground and he said, "Iran." And at first we didn't understand what he was saying, why he was saying it. We were trying to speak to him in Arabic, trying to speak to him in English. We were assuming that he spoke Kurdish. And then he just kept saying, Farsi, Farsi, Iran. And that was the first moment that we had any idea that we were anywhere near the border with Iran, and that there was this unmarked border behind this waterfall. So the next, that was the moment where my life took a turn that nothing could have prepared me for. Nothing in my life in any way ever led me to believe I'd be in that situation. We were forced into a vehicle, blindfolded, driven around the country for several days, handed off to different groups of people, and eventually driven into Tehran, the capital. We were passed off one last time, blindfolded, and driven into what I now know as Evin prison, the most notorious prison in Iran for political dissidents, where many people have been executed and tortured. They immediately tore us apart, and they threw us in separate solitary cells. And the first few days, I still struggle to describe what I was feeling or what was happening to me. The closest I've come is to describe it as sort of what it must feel like to withdraw from a drug. But you're going through withdrawal from everything you've ever loved, everything in your life that ever gave you meaning everything that ever gave you joy, everything that ever gave you sorrow, everything is gone, and you have no idea when you'll get it back, and it's a physical pain. So I spent the first weeks trying to stop myself from weeping and just falling apart completely by doing multiplication tables in my head. I would do multiplication tables as soon as I woke up until I went to bed at night. And somehow that stopped me, got me into my rational brain and made me be able to think, okay, whatever this is, it's going to be over in a few days, a few, weeks at the most. It's like being an animal in a cage, an animal in great distress, full of anger and anxiety and rage. I would pace incessantly back and forth, crouch down by the small food slot in my door, just listening for some kind of sound from the outside to orient me, to remind me that I was still in the world of the living. That animal state shifted into an almost more plant-like state, where I would just sit still and try to imagine myself disappeared, try to trick myself into believing that I didn't exist, because if I didn't exist, this pain would go away. After 4 months of interrogation, my interrogator brought me into the interrogation room and said, "Sarah, I'm sorry. I think you're innocent. I don't believe you're a spy." That's what we were being supposedly investigated or interrogated about, espionage. He said, "But this is in the hands of your government, and I don't know if or when you'll ever get out of here." So they led me back to my cell. It was always blindfolded outside of our cells, and locked me inside. And this time I remember I didn't even take the blindfold off. I was just on the floor rocking back and forth. And I heard a screaming. And it was a very out-of-body experience. And all I could think was just, please stop, whoever's screaming. Just stop. I can't take one more second of this. And all of a sudden, the guards burst into my room, and one of them started to shake me. And I realized that I'd been screaming and that I'd been beating at the walls of my cell. Now, that was the most brutal and dramatic and horrifying moment for me. And it was actually a wake-up call, because I was so shocked to have come that close to the edge of sanity. But I didn't know. I thought, this time I pulled myself back, but next time will I be able to? How many more times will I be able to pull myself back from that abyss? So in that moment, I thought of myself as, I saw my story, and I thought, can't possibly be the end of me. I mean, my mother raised me alone. She put herself through nursing school. She worked 12-hour days to give me everything, the best education, a nice home. For her, I had to believe that this wasn't the end of my story, that there would be a time that I would refer to this in the past tense. And I started to really motivate myself and get incredibly disciplined. I would exercise 3 or 4 hours a day until I fell over in total exhaustion, which really helped with my sleep and insomnia and nightmares. I would come up with all kinds of games and scenarios, speak to imaginary audiences like yourselves. In my defense, I started to realize that resistance was the only thing that was going to keep me feeling human in a situation that was dehumanizing me in the most essential way. So I would sing. Every song that I could think of, I would sing at the top of my lungs, and the women down the hall sometimes would clap and tell me they loved me. Once I was singing Gracias a la Vida by Mercedes Sosa at the top of my lungs, and the guards came in and told me to, be quiet, shh, Sara. And I sang louder, and the women cheered. And in those moments, I just knew I could do it. And I knew that someday I would get out of it, and somehow I would be able to use it to connect to other people, to understand something essential about what it is that we're here for and who we are as human beings. So 410 days later, just as suddenly as I was captured, I was released. And I was forced to leave without my husband and my friend. At that point, they started to worry that I was going to, after that incident with beating at the walls, they worried I would hurt myself, and I was a valuable hostage. I was something that they were going to trade in. Hopefully, they wanted to get some kind of concession from our government, so they didn't want me to be damaged. So I got short periods in the dog run or exercise cell with my husband and friend. But I had to leave without them, and I knew that it was my opportunity to return, the unbelievable love they gave me whenever they would see me. They were my lifeline, and now I was going to be able to fight for them. So I spent the next year globe-trotting. I worked with the Omani government, Venezuela government, Iraqi government. It was really an international effort that tipped the scale and made it so that we were, Shane and Josh were not, were less valuable. Eventually, your investment in the game of hostage-taking becomes a diminishing return, and they were released. When it was finally over, I think the first morning that I woke up with Shane, the love of my life, in my bed next to me, I was just overcome with an incredible feeling of, what now? And why should I get out of bed? All I've been doing is fighting for every second of every day for over 2 years. And I just couldn't imagine anything as important to fight for, anything as powerful and motivating. And so I fell into a pretty deep depression. And many people will tell you, as soon as you're out of solitary confinement, you think it's going to be over. But I had that to keep me going for the first year, even though all that year I just wanted to crawl back into a hole and just, lick my wounds, but I couldn't. And now I had bouts of rage where a car would cut me off and I would chase them down, and I would just think, this is like, if I had a gun right now, what would stop me? I was overwhelmed with rage and not knowing what to do with it. I beat a piece of furniture in my house into pieces one day. The U.S., I started to learn. So in my process of recovery, I started to talk to other people. Someone referred me to a young man who had been exonerated, and he'd spent 3 years in solitary confinement. And I was able to ask him questions that I'd never been able to ask anyone else. Like, did you talk to your body parts? Did you feel a kind of connection to an insect that made its way into your cell, that felt like love? Did you hallucinate? Did you hear things and see things that weren't actually there? And in hearing other people's experiences so similar to my own, it helped me realize that this was a problem much larger than myself. And I looked into the numbers and was absolutely shocked, just blown away. I knew that we had a deeply corrupt and broken, failed system of mass incarceration in this country. That wasn't new information for me. But the entire time that I was in solitary confinement, and I would see my captors, I'd say, you're torturing me. I know, I can feel what's happening to my brain. I can't read a paragraph in a book and understand it. I have to read it again and again until I just throw the book against the wall. My brain is not what it used to be. But then I got out and I found that there was not really an international consensus around solitary confinement, how much time, and even worse, there weren't laws banning and regulating it, and that we have up to 100,000 people in this country every day in conditions almost identical to the ones that I was in Iran. So this started to motivate me, and collecting these stories, traveling around the country, I came to see that solitary confinement is used as a sort of control mechanism inside our prisons that enables a system of mass incarceration. You just can't warehouse that many human beings without inevitably having to resort to torture to control them. So the story around solitary confinement, that it's the worst of the worst, the most violent people, that story, as I did my investigations and my interviews, began to change. It's so often the most vulnerable people, the mentally ill, the LGBTQ community, people that are put there for their own protection. And oftentimes it's the people that are standing up to their conditions the way that I did in Iran. And it's the jailhouse lawyers, the organizers, the people that walk with just a little bit too much dignity for that place. Those are the ones that get sent to the hole. And trying to understand this argument, and I was able to speak with guards, prison administrators, the CDCR, the California Departments of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which most of my friends say the R is silent. They brought me in to talk about the practice of solitary confinement in California, even though they say it doesn't exist. So the first thing I asked is, why are you having me here to speak to you if you don't do this in your own state? But they argue it's for public safety. They say there's nothing else that we can do to control these incredibly violent prisons. And, the studies show that England did an amazing study. They used solitary confinement for about a year or two, but they have a wonderful outside body that investigates, that is impartial, and that can go into the prisons anytime unannounced and do studies and keep track of what's happening. And they saw quickly that violence went up in the general population the more they relied on solitary confinement. Because if you can just disappear someone, if you can just send them to the hole, then you don't have to hear their voice. You don't have to deal with the problem. You don't have to in any way rehabilitate them or treat them like a human being, a citizen, someone with a future. So this has become my work now for the last 4 years. All of these stories that we've collected, I work with Solitary Watch, are finally going to be published in February in an incredible anthology of writing by people in solitary confinement across the country. It's called Hell is a Very Small Place, Voices from Solitary Confinement. And I've also wove them into a fictionalized theater piece that I wrote called The Box, which is going to premiere in San Francisco next year. My work, the role that I feel like I'm able to play as a writer and a speaker, and someone in the unique position that I'm in where I've had this kind of media attention and interest in my story, is to help just change the narrative around who these people are that end up in the deep end of our prison system. How did they get there? Why are they put there? One story that comes to mind is a young man named Raul, who wrote me. He reached out to me maybe 3 years ago, and he was in California. We had the 3 strikes law, and his third strike, they were all nonviolent offenses. His third strike was stealing a pair of jeans. The value was $46, and he was given life in prison. And he had a tattoo that affiliated him with a Mexican gang, so he was put in solitary confinement indefinitely. Raul told me that his back would go out for long periods of time because of a prison fight that he was in where he was stabbed. And when his back was out, he couldn't change the channel on the television. So he invented, and he sent me this 2-page amazing blueprint from paper, and he used rice, and he mixed it with water to make this sort of sticky glue. And he used toilet paper rolls as pulley and strings that he made out of his bed sheet. He invented a remote control that took up half his cell so that when his back went out, he could change the channel. And he said, Sarah, as soon as I made this thing, everyone in the pod wanted one. And now, for the next 2 years, I'm busy because I have to make these remote controls. There's another man in upstate New York that I visited, William Blake. He's featured in our anthology. He has been in solitary confinement since he was 22, when he tried to escape and in the process murdered a guard. And they say they'll never let him out. And he has a dictionary, which I can really relate to because I finally got my captors to give me a dictionary. And the way that I did that is I said that Malcolm X had a dictionary when he was in prison. And Iranian, regime, they really love the left and the radical left in our country, so they thought, well, if Malcolm X had one, we have to give one to our hostage. But this man, William Blake, has learned a new word from this dictionary. He only lets himself do one every day since 1987. And every day he copies out the word twice, 3 times. He makes a sentence, and he reads the sentence out loud. And he's still doing it every day. So the other thing that has kept me going with this is, and this is really crucial, so as soon as my husband and friend got out, we got them out, the California hunger strike happened. First, it was the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture coming out and saying for the first time with authority, 2 weeks can cause permanent mental damage and constitute torture. So I was in for 410 days. And there are many people in this country that have been in for years and decades. Once the Special Rapporteur made that statement, I think it really started to empower a movement. And then right around the same time, a hunger strike happened in California prisons, the largest hunger strike in the history of this country, over 30,000 people across California joined in, and one of their core demands was to end solitary confinement. This momentum has led to reforms all across the country. Last year, there were more reforms in the US in 1 year than in 16 years combined. So in some states like Maine, Washington, and Vermont, up to 50% of people have been let out of solitary confinement because of their reforms. So these are huge shifts. And not only, I mean, they're huge in these individual states. The actual numbers nationwide have only gone down, the slightest blip. It's really just a drop in an ocean. But they set a precedent, and they show that if a state like Maine can do something as simple as an audit, just force them to tell us who's in there, how long, what's their race, what's their gender, what's their age, what's the reason for putting them in. Something as simple as an audit resulted in Maine in a 50% reduction in that state. So there's no excuse for other states not to be doing the same thing, but they resist. They put up quite a fight, and that's why we need organizations like Prisoners Legal Services to continue to fight and use the legal means to keep this pressure on. But that's just one arrow in the quiver. Legal doesn't work unless there's a movement supporting it, because recently we had a huge win, a historic win in California, the Ashker versus State of California settlement. And it looks really amazing on paper. They've let over 1,000 people out of segregation. But if you read the fine print, there's so many loopholes, so many asterisks, so many ways that they can just as easily fill these cells up with newer people, younger people fresh off the streets. So if you don't have a movement keeping the pressure and the scrutiny on, a lot of these amazing wins can be lost. Another few examples of that are Mississippi closed down the Supermax, and also Illinois closed down TAM Supermax. Two amazing victories born out of movements, including amazing journalism, legal cases. Those two states, Illinois, just months later opened up a new federal facility with just as many segregation units in it. And Mississippi transferred all of the people that were in isolation there, all the mentally ill people, into another segregation unit in a different prison. So these prison systems are adaptable and wily, and it really takes a tremendous amount of work to keep them good to their word. The way that I see solitary confinement, and it's a linchpin issue, I believe. It's a way to actually attack the whole system of incarceration, of mass incarceration. Because if you take this ability away from them to just disappear someone, torture them, especially the ones that are organizing inside, that are fighting for their rights and their dignity, the prisons are going to have to shift. They're going to have to find other means of conflict resolution, of rehabilitation. But the problem is if you see it as the whole prison system as a pyramid, you can't just lop off the top of the pyramid. Even if we did have a ban against solitary confinement, the whole system of mass incarceration is really based on the same principles. That solitary confinement is the logical end to those principles. Cut people off from their communities, completely strip them of any rights or autonomy or humanity, and harsh punishment is supposed to bring down crime. But we've reached a point where that story is being challenged more than perhaps ever before in history. Presidential candidates are being forced to address mass incarceration. The president and the Pope and Justice Kennedy, the swing vote on the Supreme Court, have all spoken out against solitary confinement. So this is a moment of energy and hope and momentum that I believe that we can continue to ride until we see much more change in this system. And, ultimately, I think about the story that I told about myself when I was first put in solitary confinement. The voice that I had in my head was, "You can't do this. This is going to break you. This is going to destroy you." And as long as that was the story, that was what they were able to do to me. But when I was able to change that story to other people have done this, there must be a way, and I will find that way. And someday I'll be on the outside saying, that happened to me, in the past tense. Once I changed my story, I found the will to fight and resist, up until the point where one day the guard told me I couldn't go out to the exercise yard, and I was arguing with her in my infantile Farsi, and she reached up and slapped me, and I didn't even hesitate. I just reached up and I slapped her back. And that is what I think is happening to the story of who ends up in our prison system, who ends up in the deep end of our prison system. These are not the worst of the worst. These are human beings. They're part of our society. And really, if we can help, if they can change their story and we can help them change their story, in that process we can change our own story. Because many a time I've sat and I've asked myself, why is it that our country has this prison system to this degree? Why is it in our country this can happen, that 100,000 people can be isolated on any given day and people are not outraged in the streets? And I think that we acknowledge basic needs like food and water and air as human rights, but we don't acknowledge human contact as a human right. And it's absolutely been proven that we need each other. And these people in solitary confinement that are fighting for their human rights and their human need for connection, they're fighting for all of us. And thank you.